Late May 1946. A dirt road stretches toward the horizon under the pale blue sky of rural Montana. The air smells of fresh-cut hay and diesel smoke. At a small railway platform outside Billings, a line of men in faded work clothes stands beside a freight train, their hands gripping duffel bags, their faces blank with disbelief. They are German soldiers, prisoners of war, and they are crying. Some of them weep quietly, shoulders trembling. Others stare at the ground, jaws clenched, eyes wet. Behind them, American farmers and their families watch in silence, wives with arms crossed, children holding their mothers' skirts, men in overalls who worked beside these Germans for 2 years, sometimes 3. No one expected this. Not the tears, not the silence, not the goodbye. One farmer, an older man with sun-scorched skin and rough hands, steps forward. He shakes the hand of a young German named Klaus, a former Wehrmacht corporal who helped him bring in 3 harvests. Neither man says a word. The train whistle screams. The Germans board. The doors close, and Montana watches them leave. In the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa reached its conclusion. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, many of them veterans of Erwin Rommel's famed Africa Corps, were captured by Allied forces in Tunisia. They had fought across deserts, endured sandstorms and scorching heat, and believed in a cause that was now collapsing beneath their feet. These men were not monsters. They were bakers, school teachers, farmhands, clerks. They had been told they were fighting for their homeland. Now they were prisoners. The United States found itself with a logistical problem it had never anticipated. By mid-1943, nearly 400,000 German and Italian POWs were being shipped across the Atlantic to camps on American soil. The Geneva Convention required that they be housed, fed, and treated humanely. It also allowed them to work, provided the labor was not directly related to the war effort. America needed workers. The war had drained the countryside of young men. Farms were struggling. Harvests were at risk. Montana was one of the states that raised its hand. It was vast, rural, and desperately short on labor. Sugar beet fields stretched for miles. Cattle ranches needed hands. Logging operations in the western mountains were undermanned. The federal government agreed. German POWs would be sent to Montana, housed in camps near cities like Missoula, Billings, and Great Falls, and deployed to work on farms and ranches under guard. The first Germans arrived in late 1943. They came by train, packed into rail cars, staring out at endless plains and mountains they had only seen in propaganda films. Most spoke little English. Most had never seen America except through the lens of Nazi ideology, which painted it as a land of gangsters, racial chaos, and moral decay. They expected hostility. They expected cruelty. They expected to be treated the way prisoners were treated in Europe. Instead, they were given 3 meals a day. They were issued clean uniforms, they were housed in barracks with heat and running water, and within weeks they were sent out to work on farms where the families who owned the land treated them not as enemies, but as labor. At first the farmers were wary. These were the men their sons were fighting overseas. These were the soldiers of Hitler's army. But the work had to be done. The sugar beets had to be harvested, the hay had to be baled, and so they worked side by side, German and American, under the same sun. The POWs were paid a small wage as required by the Geneva Convention, 80 cents a day. Most of it went into camp canteens where they could buy cigarettes, soap, chocolate. Some saved it, others spent it on small luxuries they hadn't seen in years. The work was hard, but it was honest, and for many of them, it was the first time in years they felt human again. Montana's landscape had a strange effect on these men. The vastness of it, the silence, the absence of bombed-out cities and mass graves. Many of them had been raised on farms in Bavaria, Saxony, the Rhineland. They knew the rhythm of planting and harvest. They knew the language of animals and soil. In Montana, they found an echo of the life they had left behind, a life before the war, a life that felt almost peaceful. The farms were isolated. Guards were present, but often minimal. Escape was theoretically possible, but where would they go? The nearest town might be 20 miles away, the nearest border, 1,000. And why run? The food was good, the work was manageable. The farmers, though cautious, were not cruel. By the summer of 1944, the initial tension had begun to soften. The farmers realized these Germans were not fanatics. They did not speak of Hitler with reverence. They did not seem interested in sabotage or ideology. They were tired. They were homesick. They wanted the war to end. And slowly, in small gestures, trust began to form. A farmer's wife might pack extra sandwiches for the crew working the back 40. A POW might stay late to help repair a tractor without being asked. Children on the farms, who had been told to stay away at first, began to approach the Germans with curiosity. Some of the prisoners carved wooden toys for them. Others taught them simple German words. The children laughed. The ice melted. Camp life itself became something unexpected. Fort Missoula, one of the largest POW camps in Montana, held more than 1,000 Germans at its peak. Inside, the men organized themselves. They formed orchestras. They staged plays. They published camp newspapers with poems, essays, sketches of mountain landscapes. Education classes were offered, approved by the U.S. Army. Some learned English. Others studied mathematics, history, engineering. The intellectual life of the camp became a refuge from the uncertainty of their future. There were tensions, of course. Not all the POWs were the same. Some were committed Nazis who resented the Americans and despised their fellow prisoners for cooperating. These men enforced loyalty through intimidation. There were beatings in the barracks. There were men who informed on others for being too friendly with the guards or the farmers. The U.S. military eventually separated the hardcore Nazis into different camps, but the divisions left scars. For most, though, the months turned into years, and the rhythm of Montana life became familiar. Spring planting, summer heat, fall harvest, winter cold. The war raged on in Europe and the Pacific, but here in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains it felt distant. The news that filtered into the camps was sporadic. Letters from home took months to arrive, if they came at all. Many of the men had no idea if their families were alive. Then came the letters that did arrive. They spoke of cities bombed to ash, of hunger, of occupation, of the Gestapo, of neighbors vanishing. Some men wept when they read them. Others stopped writing back, unable to bear the weight of what they could not change. And in that silence, Montana became something else, not a prison, not a punishment, but a kind of sanctuary. The farmers noticed. They saw the change in the men, the way a young German named Ernst would stop in the middle of a field and stare at the horizon, his face hollow with grief. The way another, a man named Wilhelm, threw himself into work as if labor could drown out memory. The farmers did not pry. They understood loss. Many of them had sons overseas. Many of them had received telegrams with words like missing or killed in action. The war had touched everyone. And so a quiet understanding formed. These men, German and American, were not so different. They had both been caught in the machinery of something larger than themselves. They had both lost things they could not name. And on these Montana farms, where the work was endless and the sky was wide, they found a kind of peace that neither had expected. By late 1944, some of the POWs had been in Montana for more than a year. They knew the names of the farmers' children. They knew which cows were temperamental. They knew the best fishing spots in the nearby creeks. They celebrated American Thanksgiving, invited to dinner tables where they ate turkey and potatoes and pie, where grace was said in English, and they bowed their heads in respect. It felt surreal. It felt wrong. It felt like the only kindness they had known in years. Christmas of 1944 was especially strange. The war was entering its final phase. The Allies were pushing into Germany. The POWs listened to the radio reports and felt a mix of dread and hope. Some wanted the war to end, so they seized a go home. Others feared what home had become. On the farms, Christmas trees were decorated. Gifts were exchanged. The Germans sang carols in their own language, and the Americans listened, not understanding the words, but recognizing the melody. Then in May of 1945, the news arrived. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the camps, reactions were mixed. Some men cheered, others sat in stunned silence. A few wept openly, not from joy, but from exhaustion. It was over. Finally, it was over. But what came next? When would they go home? And what would they find when they got there? For the German soldiers, the experience of captivity in Montana was nothing like what they had been taught to expect. In training, they had been told that capture meant humiliation, starvation, perhaps death. The stories from the Eastern Front were nightmarish. Soviet camps were brutal beyond imagination. Even British and American POW camps in Europe were harsh, crowded, and cold. But Montana was different. It was so different that some men did not trust it at first. They assumed it was a trick, a test, a way to break them psychologically before the real punishment began. But the punishment never came. Instead, there was breakfast, eggs sometimes, oatmeal, bread with butter, coffee that was hot and plentiful. There was work that tired the body, but gave it purpose. There were evenings when the guards allowed them to sit outside and smoke, watching the sun set over mountains that looked almost like the Alps. And slowly, the realization sank in. This was not a nightmare. This was something else entirely. Many of the men had been indoctrinated since childhood. They had grown up in the Hitler Youth, taught that Germany was superior, that the Führer was infallible, that the war was just. But here, in the quiet isolation of rural America, surrounded by people who did not hate them, who did not scream propaganda, who simply expected them to work and treated them fairly when they did, the ideology began to crack. It did not happen all at once. It happened in small moments. A farmer shaking a POW's hand after a long day, a child offering a biscuit, a conversation about crops, weather, livestock, things that had nothing to do with the war. Some men clung to their beliefs. They had to. To abandon them meant admitting that everything they had fought for, everything they had lost, had been a lie. Those men stayed bitter. They isolated themselves. They reported others who smiled too much, who learned English too quickly, who seemed too comfortable. But others, perhaps the majority, simply let it go. They stopped talking about the war, they stopped defending the Reich, they worked, they ate, they slept, and in the absence of propaganda, they began to think for themselves. For the American farmers, the presence of German POWs was equally complicated. These were not abstractions. These were not the faceless enemy from newsreels and radio broadcasts. These were young men, some barely 20 years old with calloused hands and tired eyes. They did not speak much at first. Language was a barrier, but work was a universal language. A man who could drive a tractor, who could mend a fence, who could haul hay bales in the August heat without complaint, earned respect. And respect, once given, was hard to take back. The farmers were practical people. They needed help. The government offered help in the form of POW labor. The fact that the laborers were German was inconvenient, morally complicated, but ultimately secondary to the fact that the sugar beets needed harvesting and there was no one else to do it. So they hired them, they watched them, and over time they stopped seeing uniforms and started seeing individuals. There was the tall one who was good with horses, the quiet one who could fix anything mechanical, the one who spoke a little English and translated for the others, the one who carved small wooden animals during lunch breaks and left them on fence posts for the children to find. These men had names, histories, families. They were not devils. They were not heroes. They were simply men trying to survive a war they had not started and could not stop. The cultural exchange that occurred was unintentional but profound. The Germans brought with them songs, traditions, a way of seeing the world that was foreign but not incomprehensible. They sang folk songs in the evenings, melodies that were haunting and beautiful even if the words were unknown. They celebrated birthdays with small rituals, shared cigarettes with a formality that seemed almost ceremonial. They spoke of their homes, their families, their lives before the war, and the Americans listened. Because in those stories they heard echoes of their own. The farmers spoke of their sons overseas, of brothers, cousins, neighbors who had enlisted or been drafted, of the fear that came with every telegram, every knock on the door. The Germans understood that fear. They had lived it. They had seen friends killed, entire units wiped out. They had written letters home that were never answered, and in that shared understanding of loss, something shifted. The enemy became human, the war became tragedy, and the farm, for a moment, became neutral ground. The moral paradox of the situation was not lost on anyone. How could you show kindness to men whose countrymen were killing your sons? How could you sit at a table and share a meal with someone who wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht? The answer, for most, was not philosophical. It was practical. These men were here. They were guarded. They were not a threat. And treating them decently was not the same as forgiving the war. It was simply the way things were done. Montana was a place where a handshake meant something, where a man's work ethic mattered more than his politics, where survival depended on cooperation, not division. But there were those who could not accept it. Some townspeople refused to do business with farmers who used POW labor. Some families forbade their children from going near the camps. There were rumors of sabotage, of escapes, of secret Nazi cells operating in the mountains. Most of these rumors were baseless, born from fear and suspicion, but they persisted. The war was still happening. American soldiers were still dying, and the sight of Germans walking freely, even under guard, even doing honest work, felt wrong to some. It felt like betrayal. The economic reality, however, was undeniable. Montana's agricultural output during the war years depended heavily on POW labor. Sugar beet production alone would have collapsed without it. The men worked long hours, often from dawn until dusk, for wages that were a fraction of what American workers would have demanded. The farmers paid the government for the labor. The government paid the POWs. Everyone benefited. It was a system born of necessity, sustained by pragmatism and justified by the Geneva Convention. But beneath the paperwork and the logistics, something deeper was happening. Lives were intersecting, walls were coming down. The psychological transformation of the POWs was perhaps the most profound aspect of the Montana experience. These men had been soldiers, warriors. They had been trained to kill, to follow orders, to suppress doubt and fear. But on the farms, there was no enemy. There was no front line. There was only soil, crops, animals, and the endless rhythm of rural life. For many, it was the first time in years they had felt safe, the first time they had slept through the night without the sound of artillery, the first time they had worked towards something constructive rather than destructive. Some men discovered talents they did not know they had. A former infantryman became skilled at carpentry, repairing barns and building sheds with precision and care. Another, who had been a machine gunner, found peace in working with livestock, spending hours with cattle and horses, speaking to them in soft German as if they could understand. These men were not warriors anymore. They were farmers, builders, caretakers. And in that transformation, they found a version of themselves that the war had nearly erased. There were moments of unexpected beauty. A group of POWs organized a concert in the camp, performing Beethoven and Schubert on instruments they had been allowed to purchase or build. Local townspeople were invited. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they loved music. The Germans played with passion, their faces intense with concentration, and when the final note faded, there was silence. Then applause. Long, sustained applause. For a few hours, the war did not exist. There was only music. Letters sent home from Montana carried a tone that surprised military censors. The men wrote of kindness, of abundance, of safety. Some expressed guilt, knowing that their families were suffering while they lived in relative comfort. Others wrote with hope, describing a country that was not what they had been told, people who were not their enemies in any meaningful sense. These letters were read by families in bombed-out German cities, and they must have seemed like messages from another planet. A place where the war had not destroyed everything, a place where life continued. But not all the prisoners adapted. Some remained hardened, loyal to the ideology that had brought them here. They saw cooperation as weakness. They saw kindness as manipulation. They believed the Americans were trying to break their spirits, to turn them into traitors. These men lived in isolation, even within the camps. They refused to learn English. They refused to socialize. They counted the days until they could return to Germany and resume the fight, even though the fight was over. For them, Montana was a prison, nothing more. Yet for the majority, the experience was transformative. They had been given something they had not expected. Not freedom, but dignity. Not forgiveness, but fairness. And when the war ended, when the news came that Germany had surrendered, many of them felt not relief, but dread. Because going home meant leaving this place, this strange, vast, quiet place where they had been allowed to be human again. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The news crackled over radios in towns and cities across America. Crowds gathered in the streets. Church bells rang. People wept with relief, with joy, with the overwhelming weight of survival. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed. After 6 years of slaughter, it was finished. In the POW camps of Montana, the reaction was quieter. The men gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts in English that some of them could now understand. Guards watched them carefully, unsure what to expect. Would there be anger, defiance, relief? What they saw instead was silence. Men standing with their hands in their pockets, staring at the ground. Some nodded slowly as if confirming something they had known was inevitable. Others walked away without a word, retreating to their barracks. A few sat on benches and covered their faces with their hands. For these men, victory meant defeat. It meant their country had lost. It meant their sacrifices had been for nothing. It meant their families, if they were still alive, were now living under occupation. British, American, French, and Soviet forces were dividing Germany into zones. The cities they had known were rubble. The government they had served was gone. And they, thousands of miles away in Montana, could do nothing but wait. The assumption was immediate. The war is over. We will go home now. The men began to prepare. They packed their few belongings. They wrote letters to families, telling them they would be returning soon. They imagined reunions, though many feared what they would find. But weeks passed, then months, and the orders to ship out did not come. The reason was logistical and political. Europe was in chaos. Millions of displaced persons were trying to return home. Infrastructure was destroyed. There were not enough ships, not enough trains, not enough resources to repatriate hundreds of thousands of POWs immediately. And there was another factor. The Allies were not in a hurry. Germany needed to be rebuilt, and POW labor was still useful. In Europe, German POWs were being held by the British and French for reconstruction work. In America, they were still needed on farms. So the men stayed, through the summer of 1945, through the fall, through another winter. The war was over, but their captivity continued. For some, this was unbearable. They had endured years of separation, they had survived the war, and now, in peacetime, they were still prisoners. Frustration turned to anger. There were protests in some camps, hunger strikes, refusals to work, but in Montana, where the farms were isolated and the relationships between POWs and farmers had deepened, the reaction was different. The work continued. The men went out to the fields as they had before. They planted crops in the spring of 1946, they repaired equipment, they cared for livestock. But something had changed. The dynamic was no longer prisoner and captor, it was something closer to partnership. The farmers knew the Germans would leave eventually. The Germans knew they were only here temporarily, and in that shared knowledge, the bonds grew stronger. Christmas of 1945 was a turning point. The men had been in Montana for more than 2 years. They knew the rhythms of the land, they knew the families, and the families in turn knew them. Invitations were extended, not officially, not publicly, but quietly. Farm families invited small groups of POWs to their homes for Christmas dinner. The guards, many of whom had also grown familiar with the prisoners, allowed it. There were no incidents, no escapes, just meals shared around tables with children watching wide-eyed as Germans sang carols in a language they did not understand, their voices deep and resonant. One farmer, a man named Robert Carlson, invited 3 Germans to his home outside Great Falls. His wife had been hesitant, but he insisted. These men had worked his land for 2 seasons. They had saved his harvest. They had earned his respect. At the dinner table, Carlson raised a glass of whiskey and toasted to peace. One of the Germans, a man named Joseph, raised his glass in return and spoke in halting English. "Thank you. For everything. We will not forget." Carlson nodded. He did not say it, but he would not forget either. None of them would. As winter gave way to spring in 1946, the news finally came. Repatriation would begin. The POWs would be sent back to Germany in waves, starting in late April and continuing through the summer. The camps began to empty. Men who had spent years in Montana were issued travel orders. They would be taken by train to East Coast ports and shipped across the Atlantic. From there, they would be processed and released into whatever remained of their homeland. The goodbyes began. The first departures were quiet, almost businesslike. Men lined up with their duffel bags, shook hands with guards, and boarded trucks that would take them to the trains. But as the weeks went on, as more and more groups were called, the farewells became harder. Farmers who had worked alongside these men for years came to the camps to say goodbye. They brought gifts, tobacco, photographs, small sums of money, pressed into hands with whispered words. The POWs gave what they could in return. Hand-carved items, sketches, promises to write. One young German named Heinrich had worked on a ranch near Billings for nearly 3 years. He had arrived as a 19-year-old boy, thin and scared, barely able to lift a hay bale. The rancher, a man named Tom Briggs, had worked him hard but fairly. Over time, Heinrich had grown strong, confident. He learned to ride horses, to mend fences, to read the weather. Briggs treated him like a hired hand, not a prisoner. When Heinrich's repatriation orders came, Briggs drove him to the train station himself. They did not speak much on the drive. When they arrived, Briggs handed Heinrich an envelope. Inside was $50 and a letter of reference, written in careful English, stating that Heinrich was a good worker and a decent man. Heinrich stared at it, unable to speak. Briggs clapped him on the shoulder and walked away before either of them could say something they would regret. Not all the farewells were between men. Some of the POWs had formed friendships with the children of the farms. A girl named Emma, 11 years old, had spent 2 summers following a German named Klaus around while he worked. He taught her German words. She taught him English ones. She gave him drawings she had made. He carved her a wooden horse that she kept on her windowsill. When Klaus was scheduled to leave, Emma's mother found her crying in the barn. She did not understand why the man who had been so kind, who had helped her father, who had made her laugh, had to go back to a country she had been told was full of terrible people. Her mother had no answer. She held her daughter and said nothing. The train platforms became stages for scenes that no one had anticipated. Men who had spent years keeping their emotions locked away, who had survived battles and imprisonments with stoic faces, broke down. Some wept openly, others stood rigid, jaws clenched, eyes red. The Americans who came to see them off were often just as affected. Farmers who had fought in the First World War, who had lost friends and brothers, who had every reason to hate the Germans, stood with wet eyes and shook hands that trembled. There were moments of absurdity. One POW, a man named Werner, had become so integrated into the community that the local church had invited him to join their choir. He sang bass, and his voice was powerful. On his last Sunday before departure, the congregation gave him a standing ovation. Werner, a former soldier of the Wehrmacht, standing in a small Montana church, receiving applause from American farmers and their families. He later said it was the proudest moment of his life. But beneath the individual stories was a collective grief. These men were not going home to victory parades. They were not going home to families waiting with open arms. They were going home to destruction. Reports filtering back from Germany described a landscape of horror, cities reduced to ash, populations starving. The Soviet occupation in the East was brutal. Even in the Western zones, controlled by Britain, France, and America, conditions were dire. There was no food, no housing, no work. The country had been gutted. The POWs knew this. They had received letters. They had heard the rumors. Some of them no longer knew if their families were alive. Others had learned their homes had been bombed, their towns erased. They were being sent back to a country that no longer existed, at least not in the form they remembered. And many of them, standing on those train platforms in Montana, realized they were leaving the safest, most stable period of their lives in years. One farmer, watching a group of Germans board a train, turned to his wife and said, "They don't want to go." She nodded. It was true. Some of them did not want to go. They had no future in Germany. They had no homes to return to, but they had no choice. The war was over. The repatriation orders were final. They were Germans, and Germany was where they belonged, even if it was a ruin. There were attempts to stay. A few POWs inquired about immigration, about sponsorship, about finding a legal path to remain in America, but the laws were strict. They were enemy aliens. They could not simply apply for residency. Some farmers offered to vouch for them, to hire them permanently, to help them navigate the bureaucracy, but the system was inflexible. The men had to leave. Letters were exchanged, addresses were written down on scraps of paper, tucked into pockets, folded carefully. Some of the Germans gave the farmers their family addresses in Germany, asking them to write, to let them know if they had survived, if they had made it home. The farmers promised, and many of them kept that promise. The final groups departed in late June and early July of 1946. By August, the camps were empty. The barracks stood silent. Guard towers were abandoned. The farms returned to their normal routines, but they were not the same. The men who had worked the land for 3 years were gone. The fields felt emptier. The work felt harder. And in the quiet moments, the farmers would remember the faces, the voices, the hands that had helped them survive the war years. One evening, a rancher named Samuel Porter stood at the edge of his property, looking out at the mountains. His wife joined him. She asked what he was thinking. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wonder if they made it." She did not need to ask who he meant. The trains carried the men east, through the plains, through the heartland, across rivers and forests and cities that bustled with post-war optimism. America was celebrating. Factories were converting back to peacetime production. Soldiers were returning home to ticker-tape parades. The economy was booming. But the Germans stared out the windows in silence, watching a country that had treated them better than their own ever had disappear behind a pace. They reached the ports, New York, Boston, Baltimore. They were loaded onto transport ships, the same vessels that had carried American troops to Europe. The conditions were crowded, uncomfortable, but tolerable. The journey across the Atlantic took weeks. The men slept in hammocks, ate rations, and talked quietly among themselves. Some spoke of their plans, of finding their families, of rebuilding. Others said nothing. They stared at the ocean and wondered what they would find on the other side. When the ships docked in German ports, the men disembarked into a world that was unrecognizable. Hamburg was a skeleton. Entire city blocks were gone, replaced by mountains of rubble and twisted steel. Bremen was worse. Berlin, they were told, was apocalyptic. The men stood on the docks with their duffel bags, looking at the ruins of what had once been their country, and the reality of defeat settled over them like a weight they could not lift. Processing centers were chaotic. Thousands of returning POWs mixed with displaced persons, refugees, former soldiers trying to find their units or their families. There were lines for everything: food, papers, information. The men gave their names, their hometowns, their last known addresses. Clerks checked lists. Some families had been located, others were missing. Many were confirmed dead. The men received their information with blank faces, nodded, and moved on. There was no time for grief. There was only survival. For those returning to the Soviet-occupied zone in the east, the situation was even grimmer. The Soviets viewed returning German POWs with suspicion. Some were interrogated, others were sent to labor camps for additional years of detention. The men who had spent time in American custody were particularly suspect. Why had they been treated well? What had they told the Americans? The paranoia of occupation infected everything. Those who could fled west, those who could not endured. In the western zones controlled by Britain, France, and the United States, conditions were harsh but not brutal. The Allies were focused on reconstruction, on denazification, on building a new Germany from the ashes of the old. But there was little infrastructure. Food was rationed. Housing was nearly impossible to find. Entire cities had no running water, no electricity, no functioning government. The men who returned found themselves living in basements, in makeshift shelters, in the ruins of bombed-out buildings. Klaus, the young corporal who had worked on a farm outside Billings, returned to his hometown in Bavaria. The train station was rubble. The streets were unrecognizable. He walked for hours, searching for the house where he had grown up. When he found the street, the house was gone. Only the foundation remained. Neighbors told him his mother had died in an air raid. In 1944, his father had been killed on the Eastern Front. His sister was alive, living in a refugee camp near Munich. He found her 3 weeks later. She was thin, hollow-eyed, and when she saw him, she did not smile. She asked where he had been. He told her, Montana, America. She stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. Montana might as well have been the moon. Heinrich, who had worked on Tom Briggs's ranch, returned to Hamburg. He had no family left. His parents were dead. His brother was missing, presumed killed in Russia. He found work clearing rubble, hauling bricks and stone from collapsed buildings for pennies a day. At night, he slept in a bombed-out schoolhouse with 40 other men. He did not speak of Montana. He did not speak of the rancher who had shaken his hand and called him a good worker. It was too painful, too distant, like a dream he had once had and could not return to. Joseph, who had shared Christmas dinner with Robert Carlson and his family, made it back to Cologne. The city was a graveyard. The famous cathedral still stood miraculously, but everything around it was ash. He searched for his wife and 2 daughters. It took him months. He found them in a displaced persons camp, alive but starving. They had lost their home, their possessions, everything. When he told them about Montana, about the farm, about the kindness, his wife looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. She said, "That does not exist here." The psychological shock was profound. The men had spent years in a place where food was abundant, where safety was guaranteed, where work was honest and respected. They had lived in barracks with heat and clean water. They had been treated as human beings. And now they were back in a country where humanity itself seemed to have been bombed out of existence. The contrast was unbearable. Some men fell into deep depressions. Others threw themselves into work trying to rebuild, trying to forget. A few, unable to reconcile the two worlds, simply gave up. But there were those who refused to let go of what they had experienced. They wrote letters, carefully composed, written in broken English or translated by friends. These letters made their way across the Atlantic to addresses in Montana. They arrived at farmhouses, at ranches, at small post offices in towns that barely appeared on maps. The farmers opened them with surprise, sometimes with disbelief. The Germans had remembered. They had kept their promises. The letters spoke of gratitude. They described the devastation, the hunger, the impossibility of rebuilding a life from nothing. But they also spoke of hope. They thanked the farmers for their kindness, for treating them with dignity when they had expected cruelty. They wrote that the time in Montana had saved them, not just physically but spiritually, that it had reminded them what decency looked like, that in the darkest period of their lives, these American families had shown them a version of humanity they thought the war had destroyed. Robert Carlson received a letter from Joseph in late 1947. It was 3 pages long, written in careful English. Joseph described finding his family, the relief and the heartbreak of it. He described the ruins of Cologne, the struggle for food, the slow and agonizing process of starting over. But he also wrote, "I think of your table, I think of the meal, I think of your kindness. It keeps me going. Please know you saved more than my body. You saved something I cannot name." Carlson read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in a drawer. He did not speak of it to anyone, not even his wife, but he kept it. And over the years, he received more. Joseph wrote once or twice a year, updates on his life, the birth of another child, a job he had found, a small apartment his family had moved into. Each letter ended with the same phrase, "I will never forget Montana." Tom Briggs received a letter from Heinrich in 1948. It was shorter, more reserved. Heinrich wrote that he had found work in Hamburg, that he was surviving. He thanked Briggs for the letter of reference, though he admitted it had not been much use in a country where no one cared about recommendations from American ranchers. But he had kept it. He carried it with him. He said it reminded him that someone, somewhere, had believed he was worth something. Briggs wrote back. He told Heinrich that if he ever found a way to return to America legally, there would be work for him on the ranch. He meant it. Heinrich never took him up on the offer, but the exchange continued for years. Letters back and forth, a friendship that had begun in the forced labor of war and continued in the slow rebuilding of peace. Not all the POWs stayed silent. Some spoke openly about their time in Montana, though not everyone believed them. In the ruins of post-war Germany, where bitterness and resentment ran deep, stories of American kindness sounded like propaganda, or worse, like betrayal. Some former POWs were accused of being sympathizers, of having it easy while their countrymen suffered. Others were mocked for sentimentality, for clinging to a fantasy. The men learned to be quiet, to keep Montana to themselves, a private memory, a place they had been that no one else could understand. But there were exceptions. Werner, the man who had sung in the church choir, returned to his small town in Saxony, now under Soviet control. He told anyone who would listen about Montana, about the farms, about the Americans who had treated him like a person, not a prisoner. The local communist officials viewed this as suspicious. Western propaganda, capitalist manipulation. Werner was interrogated. He was warned to stop speaking about it. He refused. In 1950, he was arrested on vague charges and sent to a labor camp for 2 years. When he was released, he no longer spoke of Montana, but he never forgot it. By the early 1950s, West Germany was beginning to stabilize. The Marshall Plan had injected billions of dollars into reconstruction. The economy was recovering. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was underway. People had jobs. Cities were being rebuilt. Life, slowly, was returning to something resembling normal. But the scars remained. The generation that had fought the war carried it with them. The men who had been POWs in America carried something else, a strange duality. They had been defeated. They had been captured, but they had also been treated with a decency that many of them never experienced again. A few found ways to return, not many, but a few. Immigration laws were complex, but not impossible. Some married American women they had met through correspondence. Others found sponsors. Heinrich, who had worked on Tom Briggs's ranch, applied for a visa in 1959. It took 3 years to process. In 1962, he arrived in Montana. Briggs picked him up from the airport. They shook hands. Briggs said, "Glad you made it back." Heinrich nodded. He had no words. He worked on the ranch for another 15 years. He became an American citizen. He married a schoolteacher from Great Falls. They had 2 children. He never spoke much about the war, not even to his wife. But once, when his son asked him why he had come to Montana, Heinrich said, "Because this is where I learned I could still be a man." Klaus never returned. He rebuilt his life in Bavaria. He became a carpenter, married, had children. He kept the letters he had received from the farmer's daughter, Emma, who wrote to him occasionally through the 1950s. She sent him pictures of the farm, of the horse he had carved for her, which she still kept. In the 1970s, she visited Germany with her husband. They met for coffee in Munich. Klaus was in his 50s by then, gray-haired, weathered. Emma was a middle-aged woman with children of her own. They spoke for hours, about the farm, about her father who had died in 1968, about Montana. When they parted, Klaus held her hand and said, "You were the first person who made me feel human again." Emma cried. She had not known. Joseph never returned. He lived the rest of his life in Cologne. He worked in a factory. He raised his children. He told them about Montana. They did not fully understand, but they listened. When he died in 1983, his wife found the letters from Robert Carlson. There were dozens of them, spanning more than 30 years. She sent one final letter to Montana, info, arming Carlson of Joseph's death. Carlson was in his 80s by then. He wrote back expressing his condolences. He said Joseph had been a good man. He said he was honored to have known him. The story of German POWs in Montana is not widely known. It does not fit neatly into the narratives we tell about the Second World War. It complicates the binary of hero and villain, victor and defeated. It asks uncomfortable questions about humanity, about forgiveness, about the space between propaganda and truth. These men were soldiers of the Third Reich. They fought for a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities. And yet on the farms of Montana, they were also just men. Tired, scared, homesick men who found kindness in a place they least expected it. The tears shed on those train platforms in 1946 were real. They were not tears of nostalgia for captivity, but tears for something deeper, for safety, for dignity, for a brief window of time when the war had paused and life had felt almost normal. The American farmers who watched them leave were not naive. They knew who these men had been, but they also knew who they had become. And in that knowledge there was a quiet acknowledgement that people are more than the worst things their nations do. History remembers the battles, the generals, the grand strategies. It remembers the horrors and the heroism. But it often forgets the small moments, the farmer shaking the hand of a German prisoner, the child giving a biscuit to a man who had been taught to hate her country, the letters sent across an ocean carrying gratitude and memory and a shared sense of loss. These moments do not change the outcome of wars. They do not absolve guilt or erase suffering. But they remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity persists. Not because it is easy, but because some people choose it anyway. Montana did not save these men because of politics or ideology. It saved them because decent people did decent things. They fed them, they worked beside them, they saw them, and in being seen, the men remembered who they were before the war tried to take it away. When they cried on those platforms, they were grieving the loss of that recognition. They were returning to a world that no longer had space for such kindness. A world where survival meant hardness, where rebuilding meant forgetting. But they did not forget. The letters prove it. The men who returned to Montana prove it. The stories passed down through families, on both sides of the ocean, prove it. War creates enemies, but it also occasionally creates unexpected connections, moments where the machinery of hatred breaks down and 82 people standing in a field or sitting at a table realize they are not so different after all. The farms are still there, the land is still worked. Most of the men are gone now, German and American both. But the memory remains, in museums, in oral histories, in the letters kept in drawers and attics, in the children and grandchildren who heard the stories and wondered how such a thing was possible, how enemies became friends, how prisoners became family, how a war in one small corner of the world gave way to something gentler. Perhaps that is the lesson, that wars are fought by nations, but peace is built by individuals, that the hardest thing, and maybe the most important thing, is to see the person standing in front of you, not the uniform, not the flag, just the person. The German POWs in Montana cried because they were leaving a place where they had been seen, and the Americans who watched them go understood, even if they could not say it, that they had been changed too, by the work, by the conversations, by the quiet realization that the enemy was not a monster, just a man far from home. Montana taught them both something the war had tried to destroy, that compassion is not weakness, that kindness is not surrender, that even in the machinery of conflict there is room for grace, and that sometimes in the most unexpected places humanity wins,